All right, a lot of reaction coming in today to the New York Times reporting that President Trump himself ordered top security clearance for son-in-law and senior advisor Jared Kushner, overruling the concerns of intelligence officials. Now, to be clear, as head of the executive, the president has the ultimate authority to decide who gets a security clearance and who doesn't. But it is exceedingly rare for a president to overrule intelligence. President Trump and those involved in this story continue to deny that he interfered. The Times reports that Trump's decision was so troubling that the then Chief of Staff John Kelly and White House counsel Don McGahn both wrote memos documenting Trump's order. But in an interview in January, President Trump told the New York Times he did not tell anyone to give Kushner security clearance.
Do you tell General Kelly or anyone else in the White House to overrule security officials, the career?
No, I don't think I have the authority to do that. I'm not sure I do, but I wouldn't do it. Jared's a good. I was never involved with his security.
Now, just 3 weeks ago, Kushner's wife, Ivanka, said the president had no involvement in her or her husband's clearances. Deputy White House Press Secretary Hogan Gidley told the Washington Post, quote, "The White House treats all security clearances individually, neutrally, and equally." And in a statement to MSNBC just moments ago, a spokesman for Kushner's lawyer said in 2001, 2018, White House and security clearance officials affirmed that Mr. Kushner's security clearance was handled in the regular process with no pressure from anyone. That was conveyed to the media at the time, and news stories, if accurate, do not change what was affirmed at the time, end quote. Joining me now, NBC News intelligence and national security reporter Ken Dilanian and Bradley Moss, national security attorney. Welcome to both of you. Ken, tell us what the story is here. NBC News reported that White House security officials initially rejected Jared Kushner's application after a background check, which raised concerns about a potential for foreign influence. So I guess if Donald Trump can legally arrange to get him clearance, why would he deny having done that?
The only reason that makes sense to me, Ali, is that they were trying to avoid embarrassment. You know, the notion that there was nepotism at play here, that Donald Trump was going to cast aside the rules and the bureaucracy for granting security clearances and simply give one to his son-in-law and his daughter. But that's what happened because, as you said, we reported that the career officials took a look at Jared Kushner's security clearance application and said he didn't deserve one. They were overruled by their boss at the White House. What this new reporting says is that that man did that because Donald Trump ordered it done through his chief of staff and his White House counsel. And both of those men wrote memos about it. And so now the House is going to want to see those memos. They are investigating the whole process of how the Trump administration grants security clearances. And there's a real public policy issue here because there are valid concerns about whether foreign governments have influence over Jared Kushner because of his many foreign business entanglements.
So, Bradley, there's definitely a real public policy issue, as Ken says. There may not be a legal issue, though.
Correct. No, there is. Ultimately, there's not a legal issue here because what has been said by the White House is true in that the president has the ultimate authority. Ellie, he could give you a security clearance today. He could give you the most top-level security clearance and access to nuclear codes if he wanted to, absent impeachment or the 25th Amendment being invoked. That's his constitutional authority. But granting security clearances is a time-honored, sacrosanct process that everybody goes through. I go through it. My clients have gone through it. It's a very standardized process, and it's supposed to be handled by career civil servants in both the investigative side and the adjudicative side. They make the assessment based off the information they have, based on the same guidelines that applies to everybody, no matter what your position, no matter what your level of authority. That was not what happened here. Special choices, special privileges were afforded to Jared Kushner here. That is inappropriate. It is not necessarily illegal.
Ken, you mentioned that Congress wants to see some of this stuff. House Oversight Chairman Elijah Cummings is demanding documents having to do with security clearance, and it's not just limited to Jared Kushner.
It is not, Ali. In fact, our sources told us that on 30 occasions, the career specialists at the White House were overruled. So people they thought shouldn't get a clearance were granted one. And we don't know the identities of those people. We know that it's a lot of the same issues: foreign influence, business entanglements. There were a lot of people who came to the Trump administration who had never had clearances before. And it's very normal that there would be delays and extra scrutiny. What's not normal and has never happened before, our sources said, is for that process to be bypassed and for those people to just be handed top secret security clearances, and Congress wants to know the details about that. They are. It looks like they're going down the road to subpoenaing some of these documents. There will be a fight, though, because the White House will assert executive privilege.
Bradley, you heard Chris Christie say it. The concern for a lot of people is not that Donald Trump can give Jared Kushner top secret clearance, or that there's a policy issue around it. Why was everybody lying about it? And back to Kushner's application, if you recall, he had to make several amendments. There were contacts that he had with foreigners. He left off his form several times. There were a lot of red flags for Kushner to get the clearance in the first place.
Correct. I mean, we just heard on Wednesday issues about the president making false statements and the president attacking Michael Cohen about his credibility. This president has problems with telling the truth on a regular basis. And it raises that $64,000 question. Why did they lie? The president could do this. He didn't even have to put him through the vetting process if he didn't want to. Did they do it just because they were embarrassed and they didn't want Jared to get the embarrassment, the ignominy of a denial? Is that why they originally lied about the president intervening? And you're absolutely right. The way that this was handled from the start, from the very moment Jared Kushner submitted his standard Form 86, which is the security paperwork everybody has to go through to get a clearance, was never done properly. He did not even list out his foreign contacts at the beginning, and then he got to wait 5 months before he gives it to the FBI. None of my clients, none, would have ever been granted interim access in that context. They would have been laughed out of the building.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.